All right, you guys can see my screen though?
Yes.
Yep.
Northwest. Perfect. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming again to our bi-monthly webinars that we've been hosting. I was just telling Jim before we jumped on, I think today is like our highest registered attendees. So we're so excited to have everybody here with us today. And as usual, before we begin, we have a few updates that we want to share. So for those of you who are new on the call, as EDPA Northwest Chapter, we are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to advance the interests of members engaged in the design, production, and service of exhibits, events, and experiential environments. And if you don't know me, I'm Emma Kristen, and I'm with CSI. And I want to give a shout out to the rest of our amazing board members. So we have Taylor Freckleton with Fusion Imaging, Anna Rembold at MetaVent, Cindy McLevaney at RS Displays, Mel White at Classic Exhibits, Nicole Klein at Exhibit Expressions, Jenny Cohn at Condit, and Stan Bender at City Graphic Solutions. And we also need to thank our sponsors this year. So we have 3 annual sponsors, platinum sponsors, Aluvision, B Matrix, and CSI. And so if it weren't for their kind financial contributions, we would not be able to provide you with these beneficial events. And before jumping in, we want to highlight our upcoming events that we have on our radar. So obviously today we have the State of the Labor Industry with Jim. On June 4th, we are hosting an in-person networking happy hour in Denver, Colorado. We've locked in the Left Hand Brewing in Rhino, if you guys are familiar with that area. Should be a good turnout. We already have a handful of people signed up. And then on July 15th, we have an office productivity webinar with Heidi. And so she'll be talking about time management, decluttering your desktop, and also organizing your emails. And then in August, we are planning on doing a fundraiser, following up in September with our Texas Trivia. And as I've mentioned before, one of our commitments this year is to host a webinar every other month. So if there's a specific topic you would like us to discuss, please let us know. And as we begin today, I want to introduce to you Jim Worm. He began his career in the trade show industry more than 35 years ago and has worked almost every job in the convention center from loading the docks to the main entry. And he has played a role in designing, building, shipping, and setting up trade show booths, as well as launching and organizing trade shows throughout the US and Europe. Most recently, Jim has utilized his unique trade show experience for the development and management of the Exhibitor Appointed Contractor Association, better known as EACA. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Jim.
Thanks, Emma, and welcome everybody. Glad you could be with us here today. Pretty important topic, but I wouldn't be able to do it without my sidekick, Bill Muller with Nth Degree. Bill's the regional director for Nth Degree and is involved in almost every negotiation that takes place between the contractors and the local unions in the various different jurisdictions. I'm sure Bill really enjoys that job. There's never any frustration in that process. But Bill's got more information sort of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, as it relates to current situations with various locals. So if anybody has any questions about any of those particular issues or either points of information or little confusion nits that pop up from time to time as you're contracting with labor or contracting with a contractor that has labor challenges, Bill's your man. And what I'd ask you to do is to post your question in the chat area, and we'll get to those during the Q&A session, unless it's something that you feel like you've missed a piece of something that we've said and you'd like to know the answer right now. So when you post your question, please annotate it. Let us know if you can wait to the Q&A session or if you'd like to hear what the answer is sooner than that. And that will help us determine what to go. But Bill's going to be in charge of that as I present. And he and I were both sort of take certain swings at the content that we have provided for you here today. The first thing I'm going to do is share my screen. You give me a second to do that. Here we go. Oh, those are the questions. I'm going to pause that for a second and do this again. Go back and start sharing again. Okay. This is what I wanted to do right here. Okay. So you can all see my screen. This is the title slide, status of trade show labor. If that's working, I'll just move on. But one of the things I wanted to do to start with is just the history, a little bit of background about union presence and working in history. And so for those of us like me that are long in the tooth and have been doing this for a long time, there's been a transition from when I first started in the industry until now. There weren't really any warm and fuzzy relationships between contractors and local unions at that time because they didn't really have any relationship at all. And the reason for this picture here that you show, if somebody might have seen this in the past, you'll know that it's called a Yankee driver. It's a screwdriver that has a ratchet kind of capability to it. But in Chicago, when I first started in the industry, this tool was verboten for carpenters. They were not allowed to use it because it did the work too fast. And as you can imagine, that's certainly been sort of emblematic of some of the feelings and thoughts that people had about unions, is that they didn't really come to work with the attitude that they were going to be a service-minded process for you or your customers. But the union presence in venues is really something that gets determined by the owner of the building. Most of our convention centers are owned either by the state or by the city. And so the local union that has the jurisdiction in that venue is one that has been granted that. Tends to be something of obviously you could imagine a political determination, but that's how that is decided. And even in right to work states, that can be the case, because believe it or not, Illinois is a right to work state. But as everybody knows, in McCormick Place or at Rosemont, the unions have the jurisdiction there. The other thing that can come up is, as part of this process, and we'll review it a little bit, is that all local unions are determined, their work rules, their pay rates, when they get a break, all of that is determined in the collective bargaining process. And those contracts vary in length from a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year time frame. That's the usual length of time for those agreements. It also will include what kinds of contributions have to be made for their benefits, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But as I mentioned, the work rules are a very specific part of the process. And in terms of work rules, it describes what each local has the authority to have control over what they do. From the contractor standpoint, it also includes what tools that they're supposed to bring to the job to do the work. And the venues play a role, obviously, as I mentioned, in terms of the jurisdiction.
I'm just listening to a webinar.
Oh,
Sorry, is there a question? No? Okay. Venues also play a role. Some of you that have done shows in Philadelphia would know that previously, years ago, the carpenters were the source of labor for erecting displays. And because of challenges with the way they behaved for a period of time, they were dismissed from the building, and the stagehands are now the local union with the jurisdiction for I&D work. And now that's also being examined again. But we'll talk more about that, and that's the Philadelphia story. The contractor role, obviously, is the relationship about where sometimes you have a choice. Las Vegas, believe it or not, although most people realize or see it as a Teamster town, it's a right to work state in Las Vegas. You actually don't have to use union labor at all. But some of the contractors that work there have signed agreements with carpenters because they prefer to work with the carpenters. So that can determine what union is present at any given event in Las Vegas. And then, of course, there are right to work states. Right to work states are basically those that have determined that an individual does not have to be a member of a union in order to do work. And there's about a dozen to 15 different states that are in that classification. As I mentioned, Illinois is one of them. Florida is one that obviously most people know about because in Orlando, the stagehands do a lot of the work in the convention center in Orlando, but you don't have to use union workers. And we have a member of the EAC that doesn't use union workers to do their servicing. So COVID obviously had a great impact on the entire industry, and it certainly had a huge impact on our labor supply. And a big part of what we want to chat about today is that impact and the impact it had on union negotiations. And Bill, I'd like to just throw it to you now in terms of talking about what you guys that were contracted with unions and contracts that came up for renewal during COVID. If you could let everybody know what happened during that time.
Yeah, for most, well, any signatory contractor, what we ended up doing during COVID is we had some memorandums of understanding written so that we would essentially freeze the contract. Neither the employer nor the unions really had any leverage. Nobody had leverage during that period of time. And we were successful in extending those contracts or freezing them for a year. And so for those that don't realize, what that ended up doing is it basically multiplied the amount of contracts we had to basically negotiate in a calendar year. So on the front end of that, we had quite a few contracts, which we started in Boston. Jim, you remember that one? Right. Local 25 Teamsters. So we were successful in doing that, and it kind of gave us a little breathing room so we can kind of get our companies back online without coming up with any new negotiated wage growth or wage increases, benefit increases.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, and the other thing I forgot to mention earlier is, sometimes the question pops up, and obviously for those of you that service clients that come from Europe and they're sort of confused about the entire process of how we do shows here and that we have to use union labor. One of the things that comes up a lot, well, why do we have to have unions? But our industry would have a big challenge to try to put in the events that we do without a standby labor force. And so that's what the unions are for us, is a standby labor force that we can bring in at a 48-hour, 24-hour notice to come in and move these big events in and out of these buildings. That's been a challenge in the past when sometimes on a rare occasion we have a strike and then you still have to put in the show. But for the most part, that's what the union contribution to the industry is. And in another part of the process, I remember when I first started, I realized that these individuals that are working during setup spend more time, many times, face-to-face with your end customer than any of us do, unless you're there on site at every show. So it's important that the relationships that we have with them are positive and are moving in the right direction. And that's what we try to accomplish with those union negotiations. So supplemental agreements, as Bill mentioned, were formed in 20 to 22. If there were possibilities of doing an entire negotiation, basically the prior contract was just grandfathered and kicked down the road for another year or two, as the case might be. That created a heavy schedule for last year and this year in terms of new contracts, as Bill can attest. And Boston was the first one that came on the schedule, and it was last March. The relationship there, unfortunately, with the Boston Teamsters is probably one of the more, if not the more challenging or the most challenging one. we have in the industry. And without getting into a lot of detail there, if people have questions about that, I'm sure we can answer them, but I'm just going to move on at this point. Rate increases, obviously, were part of the conversation almost every negotiation because there hadn't been one for a number of years. So that was something that had to be managed. And then the impact on the benefit funds. The benefit funds in some cases were depleted as a result. I know that in some cases the local themselves chose to pay monies into those benefit funds to keep them positive and afloat, and so that the members could actually use their benefits. Bill, anything else you want to mention about the rate increases or the benefits?
Well, just, I mean, that all kind of had an impact on our this year's and last year's negotiations, because some of these unions, and rightfully so, they kept their people afloat. They kept their members full benefits without any contributions, employer contributions. And those that did, obviously they didn't anticipate it going as long as it did. Local 631 Teamsters and their leadership were able to cover that whole span as long as they were eligible the month that we shut down as an industry. So, hats off to them. They did the right thing. They covered their people, but on the end of that line is a deficit that they now have to recoup their contributions and their funding to their benefits, health and welfare, pension alike. Thanks,
Bill. Mentioned Boston. How about the impact on specific union locals? We're going to go into that a little bit. Many of them that I spoke to in advance of this presentation said they lost as many as 40%, but most lost something around 20% of their members. People that obviously had to put food on the table, that needed to generate income, and there wasn't anything to do in this industry. So they went outside the industry to find work. And even with their dues and benefits available to them and being paid. The other thing that is a challenge for unions as they try to build back their membership is that they have trouble with apprentice retention. The apprentice program is what is in place for all the locals, obviously, as a training program for those that are just new to the industry, coming into the industry. But they have to many times work as many as 2,000 hours to get to the journeyman status. And it depends on the market in question. And the rate that they get paid is many times, as it was mentioned to me by one of the local representatives of a union, is that they have a hard time sometimes even competing with fast food restaurants in terms of the pay rate. And the fact that the apprentice can't count on a regular number of work hours on a week-to-week basis like you could if you were working at McDonald's. But it depends on the market in question. It depends on the amount of work is in that particular market. But that is one of the challenges that they continually face. And then the contractors obviously do their best to help backfill with people that maybe that they recruit into the industry to become a member of the union, to be part of that union. And I know in Vegas, they have something called the Extra Board, which is sort of a standby supply of labor that once the full-time list of journeymen are exhausted, that they can pull from that area. But Bill, I'll let you elaborate on that.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I mean, Vegas, there's different supplemental labor sources in each market. For Las Vegas and even negotiating contracts with either an Extra Board or apprentice rate and wages. The employer side of it, we were very cognizant of the fact that we were, in fact, competing against, say, McDonald's, like Jim had mentioned. So, we knew we had a price point and a cost that we wanted to increase so we could attract more people on the apprentice side. And we did such in some of our proposals. But I will say this, as far as apprenticeship programs go, they vary in the United States from market to market. If you look at Las Vegas, it's one of the premier. Southern California, the Carpenters have a good apprenticeship program. But what we find is that when it's a joint employer union entity training center, there's much more growth. There's more proactiveness in terms of community outreach and trade schools and things like that. So as it pertains to the impact on COVID and what that had in terms of negotiations, it kind of put us in a different scenario where we had to be cognizant of all these other factors and variables other than just sitting down and trying to hammer out a contract based on purely economics. So it was a challenge across the United States for all the contractors.
Yeah, and as you probably can tell, Bill's well versed in Vegas. That's where he is resides. That's where he goes to work every day, and he's also involved closely with the apprentice program in Vegas. He's a trustee on that program and does a great job. So I want to talk a little bit now on the impact on labor contractors, because obviously not only did the local unions lose members, but labor contractors, obviously, that were shut down like we all were for more than a year and a half, or close to 2 years, that they lost lots of folks as well, and had to find ways to bring people back. Some of the owners of different contracting companies, particularly in our membership, that were approaching retirement age or at retirement age, decided that that was the best time to make leave. And so we are missing some companies that you might have seen in 2019 and no longer here. If they determine to try to sell their company, there's something that's called withdrawal liability that has an impact on them as well. If you're not familiar with that, that means that there are pension funds in various different grouping of states that might have made some bad investments and lost money. And so the withdrawal liability law that was crafted in the early 70s said that if that were to be the case, then the employer that leaves the industry or sells their business would be responsible for making up their pro rata portion of that deficit. And that sometimes gets into the millions of dollars. It's kind of a faulty process because it really is based on the idea that if somebody went out of business or sold their business, that those people that were working for that individual would be out of a job and that they would need their pension. The entertainment industry has an exemption to this law because obviously if you're working on a production for a movie and that movie finishes, then those same people go to work on the next movie, which obviously sounds very much like our industry, because if they're working on a show this week and that show is over, they'll be working on another show the following week. There's a process to get the exemption ourselves, but it's a very long process and requires the collaboration and the cooperation of all the contractors. And the major contractors like Freeman and GES have already sort of bought their way out of withdrawal liability, so that makes it kind of difficult. But it certainly looms large over any of our EAC members who are looking at retirement or a sale of their business. Some of our members, when I went and visited with them during the pandemic, had mentioned that they lost up to 80% of their people. Now, sometimes it was because of a furlough, that they were just gone for a period of time, but sometimes it was people that went and found other jobs in other industries. So the other thing that is very important in our industry in terms of labor, as you mentioned, if we've lost people and we needed to find new folks to kind of fill the bill. And obviously one of the other big initiatives for both the EACA and EDPA is a future workforce. Labor recruiting is a big part of the process for us as well. And Bill mentioned the apprentice programs already. We can answer any questions about that as we move forward. But the other thing that we're trying to do is to attract younger people into the industry, whether they're high school graduates with a GED, or they're folks that maybe instead of going to a university are interested in going to a trade school. But the apprentice programs involve a combination of classroom work and on-the-job training programs. And as I mentioned before, for the carpenters, that's 2,000 hours to be worked and involved in classroom before they become journeyman status. Bill, how about other jurisdictions that you know and other trades that you know about apprenticeship requirements? Is that similar for Teamsters and decorators?
It is. I know the electricians have a higher threshold. I think it's a 5,000 or 8,000, but 2,000 seems to be around the average requirement for on-the-job training with also curriculum. There's some hours that reflected the curriculum, which you'd mentioned. But yeah, that in Las Vegas, those 2,000 hours, that typically we're starting to see, apprentice journeying out at, 18 months, to basically 2 years. But on the quicker end, if they come in January, because the Q1 is volume heavy as it is in Vegas, we see them journeying out in about 18 months.
And Bill, are there apprentices that you know that are in these programs working their way toward journeyman status that can actually make a livable wage while they're doing this? If they're, I imagine if they've developed a relationship with a specific contractor that calls them by name, that's a possibility. But how does that work?
So in Las Vegas, for example, they have a ratio. So for every 9 journeymen, the 10th has to be an apprentice. So we look at that as the apprentice, or at least guaranteed work based on the ratio component. However, they are not called by name. So, we get them, we put in a request for 10, 15, whatever the ratio compliance number is, and they're the ones we receive, and we can retain them as long as there's work available and our numbers remain at that threshold. But, that's similar in other markets. I know in California with the decorators, it's a little different. You can call them by name. Carpenters, you can call by name. But in any event, I mean, that's where our next generation are in the pipeline. They're the ones that we want to come through the apprenticeship program based on a myriad of factors, but training is one of them, OSHA 10 and so on. I mean, it's critical to have well-trained, well-rounded workers in our field now.
Thanks, Bill. And there are a bunch of retention strategies, because I mentioned before that's a challenge for the locals to keep the apprentices and keep them in the industry and not going somewhere else. There's a program called Helmets to Hard Hats. And these are union locals that look toward those with military backgrounds, military history, and recruit them into our industry. They can use their GI Bill to supplement their pay during the apprentice period, and that helps in the retention program terrifically. And if somebody was a Seabee, and these are the folks in the Navy that build things, they can actually get credit toward journeyman status for the number of hours they work or number of years they were as a Seabee. Local 831 in Southern California also will reach out to the Coast Guard if they're exhausted of all their regular members to supplement the workforce for one of their major shows. And then, as I mentioned before, the contractors have input in that process so that there are adequate numbers to be able to show up for an event during a move-in. And many of the contractors, as you might know, do have folks that they travel to lead a job. That creates sometimes a little bit of a negotiation in terms of getting them qualified to work in the building when they're signed to a contract with the local union. Bill, you want to mention what has to happen in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, it across the board, it requires all journeymen to be working an apprentice. The out-of-towners cannot displace a journeyman from working, meaning that person could be staying home while you have out-of-towners working. There are different apparatus to be able to increase the workability of your out-of-towners per market. It varies, but for Vegas alone, if they're from another local, their benefits and wage and pension go back to their home local. If they are not, the employer has to pay benefits on behalf of that person to local 631. And that's kind of the mechanism and the mechanics behind it, I should say. But a lot of the triggers for a contractor, an employer, basically boils down to if all the journeymen are working, and then you can get to your secondary supplemental labor sources. Obviously, except for Boston, which we struggle there. I think everyone struggles there in terms of workability of outside source leads and labor.
And this is something that's pretty much exclusive to the EAC community. I'm not familiar with any of the general contractors that would travel people with the job, mostly because the general manager at any particular venue for that particular general contractor is the one that would have to absorb the cost of the travel, and they tend to focus more on the money that they can make in material handling. And this is a quality issue too. The reason that EACs would do this is because their clients expect a certain level of professionality, skills, familiarity with the job, and ability to supervise, even if they can't put their hands on, the ability to supervise the crew in such a way that the install and dismantle is handled efficiently. So the EAC community, as it relates to labor, is all about customer service, all about quality of the effort. We mentioned the extra board before. Bill, I don't know if we talked about the process that you guys put in play and how that works for you in Vegas.
Well, for us, the extra board, we look at that as a feeder into the apprenticeship program. When I say we, Nth Degree, we typically, any non-union or non-signatory workers that we may come across will end up sending them down to local 631, so they're on the extra board, so we can legally start working them. And for us, in a market like Las Vegas, the consistency of hours, I'm not saying the regular hours, 40 hours a week, but the consistency of hours really is what feeds that extra board to where it's not as transient as it has been in the past. And then from that extra board, there's mechanisms where we can upgrade them to journeyman status or journeyman rate to kind of increase their income while they're working, as the third or fourth tier down for availability, and with the hopes of then getting into the apprenticeship program and then eventually journeying out. And that seems to be working well in this market in Las Vegas in terms of a feeder program. And they're able, once they're on the extra board, which is great with what the Teamsters do in the training center here, is they're able to go get training for free while they're on the extra board. As long as their hiring hall fees are paid, they can schedule a class and get OSHA 10 certified and forklift certs, things like that. So that is all available to extra board as well. So that's really kind of been evolving into something, it's a good bench to have. And if it's managed and utilized right, the employers can really do some self-help and get their right people into the apprenticeship program and then eventually journeyed out. That is by far the best pipeline we have in Las Vegas.
And is that unique to Vegas, Bill? Is there any other local that you know of that has that kind of possibility?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there are, but I should say not to the extent that Vegas has. And I think the reason Las Vegas is ahead of other markets, one, because of sheer volume, but two, the amount of repetitions we have to get it wrong. So eventually we were going to get it right as a union partner and an employer partner, to where coming out of COVID, we relied heavily on the extra board. And so now the challenge with Las Vegas is just the amount of shows and large shows, medium shows you can have simultaneously is something that's a real challenge for everyone in the industry.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you. And and the other part is that EACs themselves have their own training programs that outside of apprenticeship programs, the EAC community looks to develop relationships with their top performers that come out of the local. And as Bill mentioned earlier, there are the journeymen they're allowed to call by name to a certain level. And those are the ones that they'll actually invest time and money in to train them themselves in the culture of their company, in what's expected in terms of them, in terms of their how they present themselves to the client. They're the people that you'll see walking around and wearing most times the company colors. They're the ones that have possibly even a pathway for promotion to not only just a lead, but a supervisor and potentially even possibility of management status. So, Bill, can you talk a little bit about the training programs from what you folks put forth for the folks in that industry?
Yeah, so for Nth Degree, what we did, we started this about 1.5 years ago, is we actually do a paid training. We do an intro training for seconds that want to become leads, And then we do an advanced training twice a year to train our folks. And some of it's refresher. Obviously, one of the big priorities for us this year is just revamping and really diving into and prioritizing, not that we haven't in the past, but safety. The way our industry has evolved and the amount of liability and some of the OSHA regulations in terms of multi-employer liability, which we don't have to get into that one, but all that plays into requiring the leads to be as well-rounded and well-versed in all those different aspects. So we've basically we put some real money to it and started doing our internal lead and lead candidate training. And within that, we baked in some, mentorships and things like that as well. But I'm sure most companies are doing some form of that because, again, we as contractors, as great as one training center is, another may not be as good, or they just focus on the GC, just, maybe forklift training and some minor safety, to where we as a company needed to kind of corral our people and train them and put our stamp on it. So when we have them at show site, they have the tools they need to have a successful show.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, these are the folks that are spending a lot of time in front of your customers. And so the impression that the client has, the end client has, is largely going to be influenced by that relationship. And the fact that these folks are trained in the culture of the company and the way that customer service is expected is a huge part of the business model. And then future workforce efforts. As I mentioned before, our organization as well as EDPA are involved in that. In fact, going to ECA Legislative Day in DC next week, that's one of the items on the agenda to talk to our federal representatives about, is getting assistance with helping us build back our workforce. So we have resources that are available to you. Well, this will be the Q&A session. We're sort of done with the overall presentation, but that URL that you see in front of you, eaca.com, it's one of those small website locations. We have on our website jurisdiction and work rules for every major market in the industry. So if you want to copy that down, if you ever have any questions about what the work rules are, who the union that has jurisdiction is, what they do, what they can't do, use that website. And just another sort of aspect of our industry, sometimes we have folks that deliver freight to the haul this way. So we'll stop now. Bill, I imagine you might have a couple of questions in that chat session. If not, this will be a good time for folks to answer questions. And I will stop sharing my screen, and we'll go to a Q&A session if that's okay with everybody. Bill, anything on?
Yeah, I see Daryl. Daryl has a question. What should we expect labor costs will increase over the next 3 years? That's a tough one. I'll try to. I would say anywhere between 4 and 6%. What had happened, Daryl, with our contract negotiations coming out of COVID, and it's been a trend that most unions are now pushing for, is that they're front loading their negotiations, meaning that, year one, we've seen astronomical increases, unlike anything historically, anywhere from 8 to 12% year one, and then we try to step that down. But when we see those increases like that, we had to sit and talk through inflation, those contracts that that the unions froze for a year. Some of those early initial ones, we were essentially negotiating a 5-year agreement within a 3 or a 4-year agreement, because in their mind, that year that they lost, they lost a percentage increase of wage growth opportunity there. So that being said, we'll have front-loaded agreements, which every single one that we negotiated have been. And then what we try to do is either stretch the contract out. Instead of 3, we try to push for 5 and walk that back to where we get some normalcy. We also run a number, we call it a CAGR, compound annual growth average. And we look at that and figure that out as an average. And I've seen on the low end 3.8, 4.2, upwards of say 6%. But the majority of them we like to keep between the 4.5%. But no, years past it was 2.5 to 3%, kind of on average, maybe a 4% year. But it's been difficult. But part of that again is we need to figure out how to subsidize to have their pension and health and welfare healthy, because ultimately that'll fall back with withdrawal liability. That could fall back on the employers again. So that was important to us. And then obviously the wages and the cities or the markets and the unions that are actually doing the good training, we decide to contribute, 40, 50 cents an hour worked into that training program, and then have the union via a joint council of both union and employer reps manage that process and have direct hands on the, curriculum and what's being trained down there. So that all factors into these larger than historical averages of wage growth.
Any other questions on the chat feed there, Bill?
Sorry, that's
There are
all I
a few in
see.
here. There's a couple in here. So Dan also commented, he said average 5-year deals I'm seeing is 4.5% year over year with front loaded increases of 7%. Then Mel also asked, how do show labor rates get established?
Yeah, I'll start on that one if that's okay, Bill. The show
absolutely.
rate basically is the rate that is published by the general service contractor. That's probably done at some level of consultation with the owner of the show. But in my experience, most of the time, the show organizers basically just give the keys to the kingdom to the general contractor, and they charge what they feel like they need to have as to cover the cost of the worker, and obviously to build in overhead costs as well as some challenge of profitability. In the early days when I was first in the labor business with a company called I&D that's now Nth Degree, most of the other contractors followed the show rate. Everybody charged show rate. But after a time, it was pretty easy to determine that rate would fluctuate depending on what the general contractor was charging for the material handling rate. And if they were making more on material handling, they didn't need to make as much on the show rate. And sometimes it would be sort of just arbitrarily lowered. So most of the EACs, Nth Degree included, established their own rates as a city rate. This is what, based on their knowledge of the rates that they're paying to the local workers, based on their own, obviously, awareness of their own overhead, they establish a rate for the city. I don't know if that would vary from show to show, but Bill, maybe you can comment on that. But my experience is most contractors that are EACs have their own rates.
Yeah, as far as the general contractors, their rates, yeah, but they have obviously other sources of revenue that they can kind of offset that. What I've also seen is, they may drop the I&D rate just a little, maybe $15, $20 above, cost, but then their electrical rates are through the roof. So they get it back from that angle too. So it's like a shell game for them, whereas EACs, for the most part, we are labor driven with one stream of revenue, to where we don't have that flexibility or agility to move around the way the GCs do. And with large calls like that, they're probably, or I know they're banking on the fact that they'll get extra board that are lower cost. They have 100 of them on their call. That all factors into their cost saving. So.
Other questions?
Yeah, we have a couple more here. So the next question is from Joe, and he says, do you think the 8-hour mini trend will go beyond Boston?
I hope not. Yeah, it's always brought up, it's always proposed. But when we look at the hard numbers, it's, do you want X in your pocket or do you want an 8-hour mini you know, it's a hard one to get around sometimes, but we've been able to kind of talk our way around it and offer other off ramps for them to kind of get some of their economic growth that the unions want. But I think there's two items that are going to come up the next cycle of contracts. One being parking. That's one that keeps coming up. The 8-hour mini hasn't come up as prevalent as parking, and that's multiple agreements. So yeah, there might be some contracts that you'll start seeing 6-hour minis, but we've done pretty well at kind of avoiding that. But it's always in the back of our minds when we sit down in negotiations, and there's different tactics and different strategies we have to come up with as employer negotiators to kind of avoid that.
And I mean, me personally, I think we should get the trend of 4-hour minis in Boston, not 8, but not
Well,
that the
agreed,
8 ones
The
are
agreed.
listed.
Boston contract's not a template that anybody wants to follow.
I know,
We
unless
just
you're the
want them to fill
worker.
our
I mean,
labor call.
Yeah.
yeah, it is for the union, you know, the holiday in the same week. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
tough up there. Okay, next. So we have a few more here coming in. So is from Lowell, and he says, what is the approximate hourly wage for show labor?
Depends on the city.
Depends on the market that you're in, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and what we see now, what we have seen is, you know, it's not only wage costs, it's also the benefits package. There's also vacation funds, which is essentially a deferred savings account, where I think the Teamsters now get a $2.50 per hour into a vacation fund that they then pull out in November of each year. But it varies per market, but it's some markets are above 100, some are probably maybe 50, 60 on the low end of a union market. But it varies really.
That's the range though, like somewhere around 50 to as much as 100, depending on the market.
Yeah, or in excess of 100. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Dan says, if you want to keep workers in the industry, how do you expect to retain workers on a 4-hour call? Think parking and travel.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, if you want to keep workers in the industry, how do you expect to retain workers on a 4-hour call? Think parking and travel.
You don't. You're not
yeah.
retaining them with just a 4-hour meeting. That's the truth of it. I think 4-hour minis are there. You know, if stuff is out of control of the contractors and everything, then yeah, that they've showed up. I mean, the way our industry's evolved, one thing that we've seen, and it's impossible to do, is different unions or entities that want to kind of reverse engineer our industry. And our hours are all over the place. It's not going to change. And by doing that, you know, there's men and women get up every day, go to work, drive 4 hours, and then they're cut. But we've had language in a couple contracts now where if you have a call and you only pay them 4 hours, that person has the right to go sign back in and basically remove themselves from your call. But I'd be surprised if any employers is working someone 4 hours, just letting them go, unless there's some performance issue or something like that. But not saying it doesn't happen, but the current state of labor right now, the only way you grow your company and you recruit is by getting people work. It's a simple process. If you don't have consistent hours, you're not going to be able to maintain and retain the people at the numbers that say Nth Degree requires. But even smaller EACs, there's always a ceiling based on the amount of hours you can have in a year versus how many people you can work.
Yeah, just a footnote, just to tag on that one a little bit. I mean, obviously the contractors, and particularly those that are, like Bill has said before, with a single revenue stream of labor for I&D, they're motivated to retain workers because they can't generate revenue unless they have people that they can count on to go work a show. The mini is really part of the process of the smaller activity that can sometimes pop up in a contractor's list of jobs to do. A hotel job, it's a small booth, it takes about an hour to set up. And if that's the only thing going on in town, they're going to pay that individual 4 hours for doing an hour's work. They don't try to do that if they want to move them to someplace else and work another show and do another job. They're highly motivated to keep these people busy because they know that they have to pay the bills at home, and they want to make sure that they are going to be somebody they can count on moving forward. So the mini is really meant for these one-offs that sometimes take place that is hard for a contractor to manage.
Next up from Crystal, we have, is there any implication of proactively increasing labor costs by 4 to 6% before they occur? Obviously, increases are felt across the board.
Bill, thoughts on that one?
I mean, it's possible, but had this been pre-COVID, I think it's more realistic. But coming out of the pandemic and the factors that we have to talk around and try to nail down, there really wasn't one particular. Now, hindsight, we know, it's fallen between 4.5% increase, depending on the length of the agreement. But yeah, I think companies try to forecast that, but there's other factors involved with insurance liability. There's all these other things that play into it as well. But yeah, I'm not sure really. That'd be situational per employer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the last one on here is Annie. She says, is the extra board per company or for the entire union?
It's for the entire union. And essentially what that does, once Journey, and I'm talking on Las Vegas and the Teamsters here, once the journeyman and apprentice, and then it goes apprentice out of ratio, once they're all confirmed for work assignments, then it goes to the extra board. Within that extra board, there are skilled extra board, and this is the Teamsters definitions, not mine, but so skilled extra board and then unskilled extra board. So the unskilled, what that means is that they haven't been vetted, they haven't worked 100 hours in the industry yet. But that's not to say they're not qualified. We pick up people every show that you have carpenters that worked 8-10 years through the carpenter local, but they really want to work in the convention industry, and the carpenter contractors, say in Vegas, they just don't have the quantity of work that the EACs on the Teamster signatory side do. So we do see carpenters coming over, making a decision to work on the extra board and then eventually go into the apprenticeship program. So it's kind of the employers will look at it, and you get someone that's really good skill set, that you want to continue to work, then you're not going to keep them on an unskilled rate. You're going to have to increase their rate, increase their status from unskilled to skilled. And at that point, you hope for the best and get them up.
There's a couple of things that I thought I'd like to mention that we didn't have as part of the presentation. Understanding that a lot of our folks attending here are working for display builders. Sometimes I get the question when I'm out at a show is, what do I do if there's an individual on my crew that just isn't cutting it for whatever reason, or maybe is making my end client a little uncomfortable? You're there as the supervisor. What can I do? As Bill or Joe would tell you, is that you're always welcome to talk to the manager there privately. You don't necessarily do it in front of the person, but just say, can we switch somebody out, because this crew isn't going to work in this fashion. And that's one of the things that the EAC community obviously will always do. They in fact do something when they start the day, because they're going to get people referred to them that they may not know very well. They may not know what their capabilities are. They may not know what their personality's like. And they'll try to balance those situations out so that there's not a negative impression created to that client for that individual. So that's something that you're always welcome to do, is talk about those kinds of things. The other thing I get a question about is what if I send in a supervisor and it's a union venue, what can they do? Well, what they can do is supervise. The stewards of the union will be around if they find that individual actually doing work or on a ladder or handling any of the display materials that could create a problem. So you just want to be in a supervisory role. And last but not least, if the supervisor is coming to the show, there's always a form in every kit that's an EAC notification form. And the reason for that is the organizer doesn't know who the exhibitor is hiring to perform the work on their booth if they didn't hire the general. And they want to be sure to know that that individual company that gets hired is legitimate, that if they've got a union contract, if it's a union town, if they've got the proper insurance to make sure that they can cover any of the things that their crew creates, whether it's a personal injury or damage. And often I find when I'm out at a show that the shop supervisor doesn't realize that that notification form applies to all service categories, not just the labor company, but also even the shop supervisor. So if you're sending folks in to supervise a show, you should fill that form out and say, this individual is coming to supervise at the show because I want you to know that they're going to be there. Part of the requirements, if you're sending that in, is you also have to supply the show with your copy of your certificate of insurance. And because when you want to get into the show floor, you'll need the credential to do that. If you've done all those things, there's no issue. But if you haven't, likely that supervisor will get stopped at the entrance to the show and say, well, you're okay to be in the building, but that's a construction zone in there. And the show organizer doesn't want to be held accountable or responsible if something should happen to your supervisor during the move in or the move out. So those are the things I think it's important for you to know as well as it relates to the relationship between labor and those of you that are coming to a show to oversee the I&D process.
Jim, I do see one more question. It's in regards to, have all the new agreements post-COVID been agreed upon, or are they still negotiations happening? And the implication of maybe an 8 to 12% increase. I think that's kind of on the high side for the remaining contracts. But again, coming out of COVID, we just don't know what to expect. But I will say this, we have two large agreement negotiations coming up. One being, we just wrapped up the local 491 DC Baltimore agreement. That got a little murky. I don't want to go into too many details, but the endorsed contract that we TA'd was rejected by the membership. So we had to go back out a month later and sit down with the carpenters again, but we hammered it out. And then we have one in Chicago that's coming up. And then the final one this year will be in Orlando with the stagehands. I believe, Jim, I want to say it's the end of August is when that expires. So they're the last two of this year that are both in obviously large markets for our industry.
Perfect. Thank you,
If there are any
guys.
other questions that occur to any of you that are watching or have attended here, or actually who are watching the video later, you're always welcome to reach out to me. Send an email. My email is jimworm@eaca.com. Pretty easy. But if you ever have labor questions and any experiences that you feel like need some resolution, or that you just even have a general question about, that's what we're here for. Our culture of our organization is that we're here to make things better for the exhibitor by way of the service that they get at the convention center. So with that, I thank you for being here today. And thanks, Emma and Mel, for giving us the chance to present this, and Bill, for your support as well.
Thank you.
But just wanted to let you know that that's what we're here to do, is to make the event more successful for exhibitors. Our philosophy has always been, because they come out of a show, they felt it all went well, and they're happy and they want to come back, then we all win.
Exactly. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Jim and Bill. I thought today was great. We will get this recording out to everybody. So if you weren't able to stay the full time or want to share it with members of your team, you'll have that available. And then we will see you back here again in a couple of months for our next webinar.
Thanks,
Emma.
thanks, Emma.
All right, talk to you
Thank you.
soon.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.